His pace quickened again. Just as recovery began, global tensions erupted into World War II. Following Japan's 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, America mobilized on an unprecedented scale. American industry produced a ship per day and a plane every 5 minutes. More than 16 million Americans served. 405,000 never returned. James gestured emphatically. By 1945, America had helped defeat fascism in Europe and the Pacific. The development of nuclear weapons forever changed warfare and international relations. As other powers lay in ruins, the United States emerged as an economic and military superpower. The student's expressions reflected the gravity of this turning point as James glanced at the clock. Just 2 minutes remained to cover nearly 8 decades of history. James glanced anxiously at the timer. Only 2 minutes to cover nearly 8 decades of history. He took a quick sip of water and plunged ahead. After World War II, global dynamics shifted dramatically, he said, his words flowing in a practiced cascade. America and the Soviet Union emerged as competing superpowers, launching the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine pledged to contain communism, spurring the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe, and the creation of NATO in 1949. He pantomimed a wall rising. The world divided into competing spheres. When the Soviets blockaded Berlin, America responded with a massive airlift. The space race, nuclear proliferation, proxy wars, all became battlegrounds in this ideological struggle. James's voice softened as he pivoted to domestic developments. Meanwhile, at home, the post-war economic boom created unprecedented prosperity. Suburbs expanded, the interstate highway system connected the nation, and the GI Bill sent millions to college. The baby boom generation, those born between 1946 and 1964, would profoundly shape American culture. His expression grew more solemn. Yet this prosperity wasn't equally shared. The civil rights movement, led by figures like Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., confronted segregation and disenfranchisement. The 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 marked legal triumphs, though true equality remained elusive. James gestured sharply as the timer showed just 1 minute remaining. The turbulent 1960s saw the Vietnam War divide the nation. President Kennedy's assassination shocked the world. The women's movement, environmental awareness, and counterculture challenged established norms. He accelerated further. The 1970s brought Watergate, energy crisis, and stagflation. The 1980s saw President Reagan's conservative revolution, deregulation, and renewed Cold War tensions. Then in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and by 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, leaving America as the world's sole superpower. With 30 seconds left, James raced through recent decades. The information age transformed society fundamentally. The internet, smartphones, and social media revolutionized how Americans connect, work, and perceive reality. Globalization integrated economies while exporting jobs overseas. His voice grew more somber. The September 11 attacks in 2001 launched the War on Terror. Economic bubbles burst in 2008, triggering the Great Recession. Political polarization intensified, culminating in the contentious politics we witness today. Climate change, economic inequality, racial justice, and pandemic responses remain critical challenges. As the final seconds ticked away, James concluded breathlessly. Throughout its complex history, America has continually struggled to live up to its founding ideals of freedom and equality for all. That struggle continues today, with each generation redefining what it means to be American. Our history is not just about past events, it's about an ongoing conversation about who we are and who we aspire to be. The timer buzzed just as James finished his last sentence. The students erupted in applause, some for the content, others simply relieved that their frantic note-taking had ended. Several approached him afterward, amazed at how he had managed to condense such a complex history into just 10 minutes. It wasn't perfect, James admitted with a smile, but history never is. The real value is in the details we explore next class. As students filed out, he knew that while his 10-minute version had hit the highlights, the true story of America, with all its triumphs, failures, and ongoing chapters, could never be fully captured in such a brief telling. He moved swiftly to the nation's formative political struggles. Our first governing document, the Articles of Confederation, proved too weak. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia to create a stronger central government, resulting in our Constitution with its system of checks and balances. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay fought for ratification through the Federalist Papers. The Bill of Rights soon followed, enshrining fundamental liberties. Several students looked up from their frantic note-taking as James dramatically pantomimed President Jefferson's dilemma. In 1803, Jefferson faced an unexpected offer from Napoleon, the entire Louisiana Territory, for $15 million. Despite constitutional misgivings, he doubled America's size overnight. Lewis and Clark soon explored this vast new wilderness. James's tone darkened as he approached America's westward expansion. Under President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act, thousands of Cherokee and other tribes were forcibly relocated along the Trail of Tears, where nearly a quarter died from exposure, disease, and starvation, a shameful chapter in our history. He paced more intensely, describing how the young nation was torn between competing visions. The industrial North and agricultural South grew increasingly at odds, primarily over slavery's expansion into Western territories. Compromise after compromise merely delayed the inevitable confrontation. James's voice fell to a near whisper, commanding complete attention. America's greatest moral contradiction, a nation founded on freedom that simultaneously enslaved millions of human beings, could not stand forever. The 1860 election of Abraham Lincoln, who opposed slavery's expansion, triggered the secession of Southern states. The room grew silent as he described the Civil War. For 4 brutal years, Americans slaughtered one another. Antietam, Gettysburg, Shiloh, names that still evoke unimaginable suffering. Over 600,000 died, more than all other American wars combined. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation formally freed enslaved people in Confederate states, though true freedom would prove elusive for generations. When James solemnly described Lincoln's assassination just days after the war's end, Jessica in the front row gasped audibly, despite having heard the story before. And thus ended perhaps the most consequential period in American history, James said, checking the clock again, halfway through his allotted time, and only a century into America's story. With just 5 minutes remaining, James spoke faster, his words tumbling out with practiced precision. After the Civil War, America entered the Reconstruction era, a brief, flawed attempt to integrate formerly enslaved people into society. He explained, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery, guaranteed citizenship, and granted voting rights to black men. But as federal troops withdrew from the South by 1877, these gains were systematically undermined by Jim Crow laws, segregation, and terroristic violence. James's hands traced invisible railroad tracks across the air. Meanwhile, America transformed from an agricultural society to an industrial powerhouse. Transcontinental railroads connected the coasts by 1869. Steel, oil, and electricity fueled unprecedented growth. Titans like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan amassed fortunes while laborers, including children, worked in dangerous conditions for meager wages. He gestured toward imaginary ships arriving at Ellis Island. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 20 million immigrants, primarily from Europe, arrived seeking opportunity. They faced discrimination, but permanently diversified American culture, building vibrant communities in growing cities. James checked the timer, 4 minutes left, and accelerated further. The 1890s marked America's emergence on the world stage. After the Spanish-American War, the U.S. acquired Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. President Theodore Roosevelt embodied this new assertiveness, building the Panama Canal and proclaiming America's right to intervene throughout the Western Hemisphere. His tone grew more serious. In 1917, America reluctantly entered World War I, tipping the balance toward Allied victory. President Wilson's idealistic 14 points helped shake the peace, but failed to prevent future conflict. The 1920s brought prosperity, prohibition, and profound cultural changes as radios, automobiles, and mass media transformed society. James's voice struck dramatically. Then came Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929. The stock market collapsed, triggering the Great Depression. By 1933, 1/4 of Americans were unemployed. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs, Social Security, bank reforms, infrastructure projects, helped stabilize the economy while permanently expanding government's role. Professor James Whitman paced nervously backstage at the community college auditorium. His regular American history class had been canceled due to a scheduling conflict, but several students still needed the lecture for an upcoming exam. He had promised to deliver the entire history of the United States in just 10 minutes, a challenge he now regretted accepting. 1 minute, Professor, called the student assistant, adjusting the large digital timer that would count down his 10 minutes. James took a deep breath, straightened his tweed jacket, and strode onto the stage. 50 expectant faces looked up at him, notebooks open and pens poised. The timer began its countdown with a sharp beep. The story of America, James began, his voice stronger than he expected, begins long before it was called America. For thousands of years, hundreds of diverse indigenous nations, the Haudenosaunee, Cherokee, Navajo, Lakota, and countless others, developed rich cultures across this land. He gestured broadly, warming to his subject. Then in 1492, Columbus arrived, believing he'd reached Asia. This moment triggered one of history's most consequential cultural collisions, leading to devastating disease outbreaks that decimated native populations. James paced across the stage, pointing to imaginary maps. European powers, Spain, France, England, the Netherlands, all scrambled to claim territory. England established its first permanent settlement at Jamestown in 1607, where colonists nearly starved before learning crucial farming techniques from the Powhatan people. Students' fingers flew across notebooks as James described how the Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded by Puritans seeking religious freedom, though ironically, he noted, they weren't particularly keen on extending that freedom to others. A few students chuckled knowingly. His voice grew more animated as he detailed the 13 colonies' development. From New Hampshire to Georgia, each colony developed distinct economies and characters. New England built ships and traded. The middle colonies grew grain, while southern colonies like Virginia and the Carolinas developed plantation systems dependent on enslaved African labor, a tragic contradiction in a land increasingly vocal about liberty. The timer showed 8 minutes remaining as James reached the 1760s. After helping Britain defeat France in the 7 Years' War, colonists expected gratitude. Instead, they got the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and other taxes imposed without colonial representation in Parliament. He pantomimed dumping tea into water. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 was just one dramatic protest. By 1775, tensions erupted into armed conflict at Lexington and Concord, a shot heard round the world. A year later, Thomas Jefferson's eloquent Declaration of Independence articulated a revolutionary political philosophy. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. With 7 minutes remaining, James wiped his brow, knowing he had barely begun America's story. The Revolutionary War awaited, and beyond that, centuries more history to somehow compress into his remaining time. James glanced at the timer, 7 minutes left. He quickened his pace, his hands gesturing more rapidly. Even after declaring independence, victory was far from assured. He continued. General Washington's ragtag Continental Army faced the world's greatest military power, Valley Forge, Saratoga, Yorktown. Each battle tested the nation's resolve until Britain finally recognized American independence in 1783.